today. In case you, I'll post a read here in case you want to keep an eye on it, or at least after the talk. But if the Zoom chat feels pretty dead, that's why. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, yeah, I've had like a no Discord rule because it's so noisy, but I'll open it up and see if I can hop back in there. Yeah, and like, by the way, feel free to, if I'm missing something in Discord,
I'll bring it up.
Feel free to just like cut me off and ask. Okay.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Summer of Protocols guest talk series. This series is part of an 18-week program where a cohort of 34 researchers are explaining the various aspects of protocols. You can find out more at summerofprotocols.com. Today, we are talking with Jesse Walden. Our next session will be tomorrow with Brian Johnson. There will be some pre-meeting reading material linked there in the calendar at summerofprotocols.com. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it off to Tim to introduce our guest speaker today.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I guess, like I was saying before we started, we've tried to limit the number of crypto people in this talk. And so Jesse was one of the few that, I definitely wanted on the agenda. And some background. So you came to crypto and had a very cultural angle on it. So you started Music Chain. I'm not quite sure when, but ended up joining Spotify through that. Then spent some time as a VC, which is still your day job at Variant. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Variant, I think, two things that stand out to me about it is one of the founders you work with told me you were the only actually helpful VC they'd worked with. And then two, a lot of firms say that they're Web3 native, but I think you're one of the few that actually try to engage with this technology as it exists. Recently, you all sort of joined Nouns DAO, which was kind of a funky thing for a VC firm to do. And yeah, I think both you and the firm have been pioneering some of the best thinking around what affordances do smart contracts and tokens afford us that are different from traditional technology, different from traditional legal contracts, and can set up different types of organizations than traditional companies. Yeah, so hopefully that context is helpful, but I think that angle and that perspective you have is will be really helpful to folks in Summer Protocols. Yeah, with that, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for the intro. Yeah, I guess I can add a little bit to that, and then I dive into the talk. So yeah, as Tim mentioned, I'm a VC as my day job, and yeah, the startup that I co-founded called Media Chain in 2014 was sort of my entry point to the space, and evident in the name Media Chain, we were thinking about how blockchain protocols could be used to track a different kind of digital asset on the internet, and specifically we're interested in digital media assets and how making attribution for the creator more easily discoverable could allow more value to flow directly to creators. The insight that I had on somewhere along that journey is we're all creators on the internet, and what sort of I'm optimistic about is that blockchain-based protocols can allow value to flow more meritocratically to those who generate it online, just in the way that information sort of flows freely through packets. I think tokens are like packets for value, and so the sort of redistribution of packets for value is what keeps me going in the space. So yeah, today I'm gonna talk about a theme or sort of a framework that I think is useful for people building in crypto, but more generally, just a sort of framework to think about protocol design. And this is something I wrote about in, I think 2019, I wrote an essay on this topic, and Toby, who's here, was a thought partner on that. So I'm glad to bring these ideas back around to this group with him as part of it. Here, I guess I'll start sharing my screen and have a few slides. The talk will be fairly short, and invite any questions as they come up or afterwards. So here we go. Okay, can you see that? Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to talk about contract theory, which is a sort of a legal theory, a theory emanating from the legal world. And I'm going to use it as sort of a framework for protocol design. So the crux of contract theory originates from this economist, Oliver Hart, Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he's famous for this quote that all but the simplest contracts are incomplete. And what he means by this essentially is that no legal contract can anticipate sort of every permutation of the world around it. So, for example, you're renovating your house. You have a contract with someone to do construction. That contract can't anticipate what happens if a meteor hits your house the next day, or the contractor dies, or you dies. There's always some exogenous variable to the contract that's sort of unpredictable. And so with that in mind, the statement sort of makes a little more sense, right? All but the simplest contracts are incomplete. A vending machine, by contrast, right? It's a very, very simple contract. Like, you put in a quarter, you get out the gum, and the sort of contract there is very, very simple. Therefore, it has a better chance of being complete. But even still, if someone swings a baseball bat at the vending machine, the contract is broken. And so, given that every contract is inherently incomplete, it follows that every contract sort of also relies on some kind of renegotiation or mediation that is exogenous to the contract itself. And for this, contracts require some sort of system for decision making or governance, right? And in the legal world, that is, of course, courts and the like. And in the protocol world, it's all kinds of other things, including rough consensus, or in some cases explicit voting and so on. But yeah, so this is the core crux of contract theory. And now, how does it apply to protocol design? And you can see here, to Tim's point earlier, I'm asking the question: how does legal contract theory apply to smart contracts or blockchain-based software? And so this talk was initially focused for crypto folks, but I think some of the ideas generalized to other protocol designs. So you could sub this out to how does legal contract theory apply to protocol design broadly? And to sort of unpack this, I'm going to just walk through two types of protocols or smart contract based systems. And on the one side, projects that I would or protocols I would describe as complete. On the other side, protocols I would describe as incomplete. So what are the characteristics of complete protocols, or protocols that seek to be as complete as possible? Well, again, they're simple, right? So all but the simplest contracts are incomplete. So the projects that strive for completeness, they try to be as simple as possible, and as a result of their simplicity, often are deterministic in nature, right? They specify as much of the eventual outcome as possible. I think they often seek to be trust minimized, right? You don't, the vending machine example earlier, right? You don't have to trust really anyone except the manufacturer of the machine, that they encoded the thing to work when you put the quarter in. Difficult to change and scalable through automation. And examples of protocols with these characteristics emanating from the crypto world are, the original Bitcoin, Ethereum, Uniswap. These are all, I would argue, systems that strive for these characteristics: trust minimization, hard to change, scalable through automation, deterministic, and simple in relative terms. I would emphasize simplicity for the original Uniswap protocol for those that are familiar. So let's contrast that with a set of other protocols that I would describe as incomplete, which tend to be more complex. They need interpretation, they require governance, and they cannot scale through automation, meaning they have some kind of dynamic subjective input that's required to keep these protocols operational. And in crypto, some modern examples are, for example, Aave, which is a DeFi lending protocol, requires constant parameterization in order to function as a lending marketplace. There are a number of risk parameters in terms of what can get lent out at what rates and so on, that need to be sort of dynamically tweaked over time in order for the marketplace to function. Nouns DAO, which Tim mentioned, we are participants in at Variant, is another great example. It's a community of people who share ownership in an asset class, which is the nouns NFTs, and those NFTs allow them to vote on a shared treasury and its deployment. So there's a protocol for how decisions get made, but it's fairly complex. It requires voting, explicit governance, can't scale through automation. It's subjective and very human driven. So it's more of a social construct. And then there's protocols like Block DAO, which is similar to Nouns, sort of human-based governance system for managing a treasury, but has some interesting sort of innovations in terms of how its governance protocol works. Instead of just straight voting, there's some neat features like the ability to rage quit or exit the community with your pro rata share of the treasury if a decision is made that you don't like. And that's sort of a novel governance mechanism that you don't see in corporate governance, for example, but takes advantage of the unique properties of smart contracts. So these are just a few examples of again, projects that I would kind of crudely classify as striving for completeness, whereas there's a set of other projects that are kind of inherently incomplete. So what is the point of this framework? Well, in 2019, when I first wrote about this topic, I was trying to suss out, which kinds of projects are most interesting in crypto specifically. But again, I think this can generalize to other areas of protocol design. And at the time, my thought was, the most interesting things in crypto, the most interesting things built on blockchains are likely going to be incomplete protocols that require sort of subjective human input, dynamism over time that are sort of better suited to adaptation and evolution, and surprise, because that's, if you look at the history of startups, those things are often characteristic of any successful startup, just being able to evolve really quickly, adapt, and sort of stumble on pleasant surprises. And so I was, the reason I felt compelled to write this down at the time was that I think that the conversation was dominated instead by folks who really leaned into the automation of blockchain computers and smart contracts as sort of the key property of these systems that wasn't unlocked. So again, the example of Uniswap was sort of at the fore in 2019, sort of right after its release. And Uniswap was this very simple, completely automated smart contract, no governance, very minimal surface area. And so folks were very, very excited about that, excited about the automation of blockchain computers. And I felt as though there was a need to call out, hey, wait, there's this whole other class of incomplete protocols where we can innovate on governance and so on to make them work. Today, my thoughts are a little bit different. Sorry, let me back up a sec. So yeah, the critique at this time that was prevalent was that incomplete systems, they just don't take advantage of the deterministic or trustless capabilities of crypto computing platforms. There's more vectors for things to go wrong. Governance is messy. Human actors are messy. Potential for Sybil attacks and so on, right? So automation was seen as clean, complete systems were seen as clean, incomplete systems were just kind of more complex and therefore less desirable. But again, they often do innovate on, a core new dimension that crypto uniquely enables, which is distributing ownership. So that, again, the ability to distribute ownership in the form of tokens in the same way we distribute packets instantly to anyone, anywhere in the world. That's something that's fairly new. And as a result, you can have, new sort of representative forms of stakeholder ownership and control. And there are these new deterministic processes for social coordination or organizational operation, delegating voting, for example, and fancy forms of voting and governance like the rage quit mechanism in Malak DAO that I mentioned. So that I felt compelled to sort of draw that out at the time. Today, my view has sort of evolved, and I would say that I'm excited about protocols at either extreme of the spectrum I'm describing in this framework. So protocols that are as complete as possible have proven to be quite systemically important for the ecosystem. And I think they're interesting for all the reasons people thought they were back then, which is complete automation, the sort of lack of messy humans in the mix. I think is a really powerful property of smart contract-based protocols, and frankly, like most software protocols that we use today are similar in nature. They're difficult to change, and if you can come up with a primitive that solves a job to be done and is robust over time, that to me is one extreme that is proven and continues to be interesting. And the other end of the spectrum is also interesting in theory, though less so in practice today. So I'm still very excited about the idea that we can coordinate new forms of human organization using these novel mechanisms and the sort of distribution of ownership to fill in the holes in incomplete contracts with dynamic human input. But there, I would say we haven't seen enough innovation on the sort of novel mechanisms to do so. I think we've covered most of this. I'll just skip over this slide. Worst place to be, in my view, is kind of in the uncanny valley between these two extremes. And that's where I would argue many crypto protocols are today. So again, many protocols are neither fully automated or complete, nor are they have they figured out sort of novel or effective mechanisms for coordinating the sort of governance or human inputs required to to do things at scale. I watched Simone. I watched your talk during the Summer Protocols program. I think you covered this point quite well. That the subjective aspect of DAOs is very sort of like poorly executed by most of them today. It's informal, and the result is that you have a handful of people at the center of these things LARPing decentralization, whereas a preferable structure might be just classic hierarchical decision making, right? Like the social constructs that work in government and corporate hierarchies. But today we have relatively informal decision making protocols in incomplete systems and in crypto, and that I would argue is very suboptimal. It puts us in this uncanny valley between complete and incomplete. But a slight bit of optimism. I think there are some projects, new projects that are trying to actually combine the best of both worlds in a way that doesn't put them in the uncanny valley. And one example is the recently released Uniswap v4. So 4 iterations after this framework was sort of initially created. Uniswap v4 is fully autonomous. Their governance controls very little in the protocol itself, but it introduces a new concept called hooks. Hooks are just sort of modular pieces of the protocol that anyone can plug in to customize functionality as they see fit. And so why I think this is interesting as a sort of a general framework for protocol design is it seeks the core protocol seeks completeness on the things that it does. And yet it enables sort of a market-driven mechanism for custom logic to be plugged in for the protocol to adapt and evolve over time. And that's the sort of characteristic of incomplete systems that I was enamored with before, right? So this is interesting because there's this mechanism for evolution, adaptability, surprise that's market driven, does not rely on the messiness of human voting, and that is informal and subjective. And as a result, I think combines the best of complete systems with that of while leaving a little bit of room for incompleteness and for the market to fill in that gap. So this is where I guess I'll park it. And the general provocation for protocol design is to completely specify and automate what you can, while explicitly delegating what you cannot automate. And explicitly delegating, I think, is can be interpreted different ways, but you could delegate, for instance, to the market, as I just described in the Uniswap example. You could delegate in governance formally to hierarchical decision making. But this is the general provocation that I think comes from this simple, like, reductive framework, is to seek completeness where you can, try to automate what you can in protocol design, especially if you're building in crypto, where automation is the property of blockchain computers that's most exciting. They can run the code for you, and then explicitly delegate what can't be automated, where there are elements of protocols that are incomplete. So yeah, I'll park it there. It's very simple, kind of reductive. I wonder if it prompts any questions, or would love people to poke holes in it. And that's it.
Awesome, thanks. I'll start with one question based on your last slide, actually. So, when you mention explicit delegation, is that what you see as the main value for, like, crypto tokens? Because I think one, like, higher level theme that's come up this summer is, like, what value do tokens add to crypto protocol that, other protocols don't have? And even when you look into crypto, like you mentioned, something like Uni V1 obviously did not have a token, as being like an example of a complete protocol. So yeah, I guess I'm curious, do you see the main value out of token as, like, more explicit or more fluid delegation of certain powers? If not, why do we have tokens? What does it give us?
I admittedly have, like, kind of like what I would describe as, like, a kind of conservative view on this. So I think that, like, so I've written before about, like, tokens as products. This is a different framework that I use. But I think, like, a useful way to think about tokens is as products in and of themselves. They require engineering and design, mechanism design. To launch one, requires sort of, like, marketing. So there's a lot of like, shipping a token for a crypto protocol, I think, is in many ways similar to shipping a product, and it's a product that's distinct from usually the core of what someone is building, especially, like, at the application layer. So, like, Uniswap is an application, and then separately there's the Uni token, and you have to kind of, like, ship the protocol. You have to separately ship a token that makes sense, and there's kind of the same sort of effort that goes into building a product, and shipping a product goes into shipping a token. So why am I bringing this up? I think in product design and product management, there's this sort of belief that products should solve a job or solve a problem for users. It's the jobs to be done framework, right? Like, what job does your product do really well for the user? Cynically, I think the job that most tokens do for users, or the job most users would like their tokens to do, is for them to go up in value. There's, like, that, obviously there's no beating around the bush of that. I think that we would be better served to just acknowledge that economic alignment with products and services that people use every day is, I think, kind of the primary job most users are seeking from their tokens. I think what supports this view, this kind of cynical view of tokens, that it's just about economic alignment, is that control or governance rights, which many of these tokens afford users, is not exercised by the vast majority of users. Like, most people do not participate in governance and voting. Same is true in shareholder voting. Same is true in democracies, right? So people want passive economic alignment with the products and services they use, and I think there's nothing inherently wrong about that with that, right? Like there's no judgment on this. I think it's just the reality. So so given that, I think projects would do well to just putting regulation and whatnot aside. I think projects would do well to just acknowledge this reality and say, look, economic alignment is a new tool in the toolkit. We can now distribute economic value to our users and align their incentives with the growth of this thing. And that's a new way to grow protocols sort of bigger, faster than we otherwise might be able to. But with that, we should not be expecting governance to just happen miraculously or participation to be high. And so we need some other mechanism in place to make decision making more efficient and representative on behalf of the users, and so that like delegation there, I think is one path to doing it. But I think there are likely other things that, like the Malak DAO mechanism for rage quitting, for example, is an innovation in governance that gives users some kind of new control or representation that you didn't have in traditional corporate governance. So yeah, Tim, I don't know if that answers your question or directly, but it's sort of my view that delegation is sort of a conservative, tested and true way to scale subjective human decision making in incomplete systems. And given that the assumption that most users just want economic alignment, I think giving tokens delegation powers and sort of just leaning into that may be a path that projects can explore more fully.
I think that makes sense. I have one follow-up and then we can open it up, but it would be, what are cases where, potentially economic alignment is not like a net positive, or like the added financialization that you create, in the protocol is actually a net negative. Do you think there are such cases? Either
Definitely, yeah. I think there's no question. It's well studied that like replacing intrinsic motivation with extrinsic motivation is can undermine behavior that you would otherwise hope to see. Like I think the famous example of the daycare that told parents, you can be late and you just pay $20 for every 5 minutes that you're late. And then sure enough, everybody turned up late and because they felt that they could just pay for it instead of like being bound by the intrinsic sort of social contract. So yeah, I think economic incentives are not for every are not going to elicit the kind of behavior you would want to see in every single instance, but can be very effective in eliciting new kinds of behavior or things that you might not otherwise be able to get people to do. And I also think sort of careful design of how economic incentives are deployed, more careful than we've seen in the crypto space in particular, can sort of strike the right balance. So, for example, subjecting economic incentives to some kind of lockup period or vesting like we do in employee stock option plans in corporations. We haven't seen many projects experiment with that, but maybe that gets you the right mix of sort of intrinsic behavior and long-term, economic incentives. So simple things like that, I'm optimistic about can be, improved in the crypto space to continue to use economic incentives, which is this new tool in the toolkit, but get or preserve intrinsic motivators for folks that are long-term aligned.
Thanks. That makes sense. Okay, let me pull from the chat now. So Rafa had a question about your 2019 insights. And okay, so basically, yeah, does Web3 social change your view around complete versus incomplete protocols, and how tokens can like channel value back to creators? And he says it feels like authorship and channeling reward to creators has been stifled in many ways by other challenges with blockchain technology. So is the tech just not ready, or have your views evolved specifically on the social side since 2019?
Just a quick amendment to the question. Less about the complete incomplete theorem. I'm more curious about, given especially your experience with seeing so many startups in kind of Web3, if your initial insight with regards to channeling like rewards and authorship to creators, if you still believe that's hold, or there's like caveats, or that insight has changed.
I think on the whole, like I would say I'm still optimistic. I think, and I think it has largely held true that, like, you know, as for example, like the very simple take here is, you know, NFTs are a new way for creators to monetize, you know, and to reach, I would argue, capture more of the value they create directly. Today, there are new marketplaces that intermediate the relationship between creator and their collector. But the take rates on those marketplaces are much lower than, you know, Web 2 take rates, and potentially are compressing to zero, because of how fierce the competition is. And I think that is due to the architecture of these systems, right, where the assets that are, you know, being created by creators and being sold are, you know, totally open, and so the competition is 10 times more fierce, and the platform lock-in is 10 times lower, and so on. And so on the whole, I do think that that these systems are sort of fulfilling the, you know, the general direction of our thesis, which is like more value to the people who create it directly. And you know, that's the example I gave is just through NFTs. I think we will see more platforms, more marketplaces try to win by virtue of not only sort of reducing fees to zero or operating costs, but also distributing ownership of the marketplace itself to the creators who are generating the value. And I think we, you know, most recently we saw this play out with Blur, NFT marketplace that is now successfully kind of competing with OpenSea as a result of doing that. What did they do that optimally or in a sustainable way? Probably not. So I think the model for, you know, just using ownership as a tool to distribute value to creators and gain a competitive edge, like that, the playbook is still being written there, you know, 4 years after writing this initial post. But I'm still optimistic that it's this sort of directionally is underway.
Thanks. There's a question that's come up. It's like morphed into a whole discussion now in the Discord thread, but I think
I'm trying to keep up.
Yeah. I think Angela like has it in the most concise way as a single question, but it can definitely expand in different directions. So the question is like, what if the world changes after you complete the design, and then subjectively, you know, you need to change things. This happens, you know, say like Ethereum is a great example of this, you know, at the given point in time, it's complete, but obviously we hard fork it, you know, every year or 6 months or something like that. So clearly there's like some aspect of like the world changes, or we want to change the protocol. So the complete things has to be incomplete again. How do you think about that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is a great point to bring up, and I think it just sort of reaffirms the quote from Oliver Hart, right, that all but the simplest contracts are incomplete, right? So even the systems that strive for completeness, like Ethereum, which aims to be this sort of deterministic automaton that just runs sort of in perpetuity, it is inherently incomplete. It needs to evolve. It needs to adapt to the world around it, and it does so through a social protocol for evolution, which is you know, hard forks by rough consensus. And so I think this is the reality, is all but the system, the simplest things are incomplete inherently, and then you have to fall back to some mechanism, and you know, like to strive for trust minimization and difficulty of changing. I think Ethereum's approach of rough consensus is absolutely the right one. For other systems that are inherently less strive for less completeness because they require much more dynamic input over time, you probably want a different system that's not rough consensus as sort of the social protocol for decision making. I don't know if Angela, that answers the question, but that's my thoughts.
Hi.
We can hear you.
Oh, we could hear you, and now we lost you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, That's
You're
fine.
good. You're good.
Okay, now you can hear me. Sorry, I'm sitting on a couch with a bunch of laundry, so ignore the background. So yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I think they have to be characterized as always striving for these things. Like from my perspective, it's really helpful to I can't get around the idea that the game is never closed. Right. In protocol design, right, nothing is stagnant and the world changes, like the layer twos have changed the incentives at the base layer, and it all interacts constantly. So I'm wondering actually if the complete framing is useful here. Like I'm not sure what I would actually put in the complete bucket ever.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I kind of agree with you that nothing is truly complete. There are just projects that strive for it more than others. And then there are projects that maybe don't admit how incomplete they are. And that's where that's how you end up in the uncanny valley, is like there's some projects striving for completeness. There's others that just can't, but say that they are. And then they many of the sort of projects that have DAOs today, they espouse decentralization and automation, but they don't really have it, in fact, and they need something different to make their systems work. And I think they'd be better off just acknowledging that and trying to formalize a system for subjective, dynamic human decision making. So I think the point you're bringing up is a good one, which is there are really no projects that are truly complete forever. The world changes and they need to adapt. But there are projects that do espouse the values of completeness. They seek to be very difficult to change over time. They seek automation and determinism as much as possible. And I do think that's a good design principle for certain types of protocols, even though it may be unattainable, and you always need to fall back to some decision-making apparatus as the world comes at you.
Yeah, I have more kind of follow up on this, but I don't want to hog your time. So maybe if we have time at the end. Thanks.
I guess, yeah, the chat is really going wild at this point. It's hard to parse out any questions, but if anyone has Dorian, you have a question? Okay. I was going to say, raise your hand in the Zoom and we can use that as a signal.
Yeah, so I just just riffing on your provocation here, Jesse. So the first thing that got me thinking, of course, was Gödel's theorems. Although that's the formal system is either it's either consistent or complete, and if it's complete, it's not consistent, of course. So the language is inverted. But also there's there was a paper by Hao Wang called Games, Logic, and Computers, where he sort of proves out that there is a for games that have and he means formal games, right? Games that have a game tree that's like certain characteristic. I can't remember what it is, but basically a simpler game than chess can either be one of two things. It can either be unfair, so that the first mover always wins, or it's futile, like tic-tac-toe, where if you play perfectly, you always end up in a draw. And then finally, Meyer-Lehman's laws of software evolution, that where he characterizes S programs, which stand for spec, P programs that stand for problem solving, and E programs that stand for situated in an environment. And he talks mostly about the E programs, but the S and the P programs are like bench testable, like that's kind of their characteristic. And the thing that got me thinking was like, to what extent is there actually like a mathematical description of where the line is between what you're calling complete and incomplete? Like, is there a way to actually say, well, if it has this characteristic, then it's necessarily incomplete, which would be I would imagine the gold standard. It's like, if you see this, it's kind of like, if you see a fat-tailed distribution, it has no variance, and therefore you're all bets are off as far as any kind of mean variance analysis, kind of that kind of thing. So yeah, you just got me thinking. That's kind of just where my mind is going with this. It's like there must be like or not necessarily must, but like, what if there is a bright mathematical line that distinguishes these two categories.
It's an interesting question. I feel only equipped to answer it in the context of crypto, which is what I know best. I think outside of crypto, there's probably very different answers here, but yeah, maybe a rule of thumb is sort of what Angela was getting at, which is basically if change to the protocol can only happen by way of hard fork, meaning there is no dynamic sort of parameterization that can occur in the canonical instance of the thing. Like you have to hard fork the canonical instance in order for it to change and evolve. Maybe that is the bright line, right, between things that strive for completeness and things that strive or that are inherently incomplete. If there's dynamic parameterization, it's incomplete. Like it needs some sort of ongoing maintenance to function. If hard forking is the only way to change or adapt, again, it's not fully complete, but it's probably striving for it as much as possible.
I guess so. Yeah, you just sort of got me thinking too, like say something like kernel modules, right? Where you could update the modules in a kernel without rebooting the machine, but if you update the rest of the part of the kernel that isn't the modules, you need to reboot the computer. And I mean, a hard fork is effectively rebooting the computer. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're just getting me thinking.
Cool.
And
Tim, anything else? Go ahead.
I have a follow-up on that. And then, if anyone else has specific questions, please raise your hand in Zoom. That I think will be the easiest way to triage them. But so you mentioned, the idea of like a hard fork being like the potential breaking point, or like it's delineation point between completeness and completeness. What do you think of something like, the rights to exit? Where like you have some of these protocols that, like are deployed on chain and have something like, say, like a 7-day window before the chain goes live, which gives you like a chance to, like leave if you're not happy. And similarly, the thing that, L1 blockchains have is they give you the right to fork, right? Like if you don't run the hard fork software, you just stay on your chain on the version of the world. So do you think like either of those things affect like the sort of striving towards completeness, or the, like how users should perceive these protocols?
It's interesting because I think the user perspective on like the user looking at this framework is maybe it's like confusing in that the user doesn't care. Like if it doesn't matter to the end user whether the system is like the system itself is complete or incomplete, because the user always has the right to exit in theory, right? You can always like just stop using the thing, or in the case of blockchain-based protocols, because they're open, you can redeploy them and tweak them as you see fit, which is the hard fork kind of path. And you can hard fork a system that is incomplete. For example, you could hard fork Nouns DAO, you could hard fork Aave, like these examples I gave of incomplete systems. You could also hard fork Ethereum or hard fork Uniswap. So in theory, the user has lots of agency to just leave. And in practice, though, these systems, these protocols have strong network effects, and I think that is why in practice users have, just despite the ability to exit, like there's a huge social cost or switching cost to get people over to hard fork, and therefore it's a lot easier said than done. So maybe the relevant question then becomes like, which of these two types of systems, complete systems or incomplete systems, actually give users more agency? And I would argue that for your average or median independent user of a protocol, incomplete systems are potentially more representative or give users more agency because they have some explicit mechanism for user control, or at least they have the potential to do that. I think a lot of crypto protocols are exploring ways to give users agency and control. For example, voting. Whether or not they take advantage of it or want to express themselves through that mechanism is another story, but at least there's this opportunity for individual users to be represented. In the hard fork scenario, again, because there's no formal mechanism, the coordination cost is a lot higher, because coordination is sort of unspecified. If it happens by rough consensus, there's inherently a lot more friction, and therefore the median independent user or individual user has less agency. So I don't know. That's where my thought goes there. It's sort of a different question, but riffing on yours, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. Seth.
Sure. Yeah. Apologies that I'm on the move, so can't put my camera on during the question. But I'm trying to take this maybe out of the world of crypto for a moment and moving into sort of a more I have a lot of background in working out tournament rules for video games, sometimes quite high stakes, right? So millions, tens of millions of dollars in some cases. And I guess I just want to sort of respond to the provocation sort of from the practical side and think about what we're going for when we make these rules is actually not completeness, and the value of completeness kind of runs out quickly. So we're aiming at sort of like a mostly complete, or we've swatted most of the big problems or sort of known bugs. And then from there, what you want to optimize for is like speed of update and sort of punitiveness for people who are trying to play at the margins of the rules. Like rather than playing the ostensible game that we agreed to play, they're playing sort of like rule manipulation, kind of edge case games that may undercut what we see as the value of the tournament in the first place. So it may sort of undercut the value of the game. So we shift away from completeness, I would say, quite quickly, and then just more be on the lookout for sort of meta updates, or like, oh, there's a new technique or a new trick that people are using. Is there sort of counterplay to this, or is it sort of degenerate and is hurting the game, which requires a very subjective judgment, but is often sort of widely agreed. So if it's draining the competitive enterprise of value, and then I thought your point about forking the system, exiting or hard forking the system would be like, well, I don't want to compete in this tournament anymore. But you're right that there is a huge cost in that, right? Especially if there's sort of like the Super Bowl and the Super Bowl has rule problems, right? We wouldn't immediately just go to some other sort of new Super Bowl or Super Bowl 2. We would want to patch the rules or sort of fix that up because we have some sort of investment in the Super Bowl to date. So anyway, I guess it's more about for us just trying to stop people from playing gamesmanship rule and trying to go to the rules plus one kind of status and seeking advantage around playing with those rules, which is very hard to do. But it is not about completeness. And I think it's sort of explicitly not about completeness. It's sort of the trying to get most of it and then stepping back from that and mostly just looking to speed of responsiveness rather than adding more rules, right? Like you sometimes add more rules, but that's not the end goal. So this is more just of a practical reflection. And maybe there's something in there that shakes loose from looking at it from a slightly different perspective. And again, something that's very much in the world and happening with lots of clever teenagers breaking the system and great joy and cred for finding ways to break the system. Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting insight. And at the end of my slides there, I gave this, sorry to keep bringing it back to crypto. It's sort of all I know really, but the example I gave at the end was Uniswap v4, where again, much of the system is sort of specified. It's sets a bunch of ground rules, aiming for completeness, but then leaves open-ended these sort of modular components that can be plugged in by anyone in the market. And so bringing that into the world of games, it's just letting the market play games and figure out which sort of modular components are going to perform best in the game of the market. And some of them I'm sure will be like malicious plugins that hurt users and foul up the gameplay or whatever. But the assumption is that the Uniswap protocol itself is not going to take a view on that. Rather, the protocol is just going to let the market do its thing and sort of let the best plugins win. So anyway, I think Seth, what you're bringing up, this idea of seeking to set the rules as best you can, but then leaving sort of some element for surprise and then responding to that. There's different ways to respond. It sounds like in the tournaments you're designing, like you are the command and control response center. and then another mechanism is the market, another mechanism is governance, and yeah, just being really explicit about which one is the right fit for the protocol you're designing, I think is important. Angela has a hand up.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to kind of, I guess, continue what we were talking about before. So something that, has, I think, been going on, a trend over the past few years has been, right, to want to be able to say that you've thrown away the key and no one has any power, right? Because that's viewed as maybe a legally beneficial position to be able to have, right? That there can't be accountability if no one can do anything. And so I've noticed that trend happening, and that's actually kind of being proposed into law in this new legislation that's been proposed in Congress, where it's talking about, like, once you reach this decentralization status, you get to be treated as a commodity, right? So there's like a legal reward for this,
right?
And that seems troubling to me from like a safety and security and soundness of the blockchain perspective, right? That there is this need to pretend that the system is complete and won't need anything more in the future, but that's not true. But there's a carrot, a legal carrot for that. And it's interesting to me too, because, right, this is just another example of how the world changes, and incentives outside the system that were not baked into the design originally can continue to shape the incentives and completeness. So anyway, just thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think definitely agree with the idea that in the realm of crypto there is this reward for what is known as sufficient decentralization, or what you said is, like, you threw away the key, you don't control, nobody can control it, and part of, I think, my 2019 thinking on this topic, where I sort of pointed out in my talk that, like, people were obsessed with this idea of completeness. I think in large part was driven by that. So the concept of sufficient decentralization came about in 2019 when Bill Hinman at the SEC uttered the words sufficiently decentralized in describing Ethereum, so as to be clear that Ethereum is not a security but a commodity. And since that point in 2019, I think the entire crypto protocol space has been chasing sufficient decentralization by way of seeking completeness, or LARPing completeness. And that's where this uncanny valley comes into play, where I think a lot of projects have fallen into it because they're seeking completeness, but they're unable to achieve it because the way their systems work, they're too complex to be automated, and you just can't throw away the key. You need humans in the loop somewhere. And so, yes, I share your concern that, like, this sort of legal setup that protocols should be sufficiently decentralized or should be complete, as specified, is setting up a lot of projects for failure, in that they're sort of not acknowledging or not leaning into the incompleteness of their systems and formalizing the areas that they're incomplete, because they feel like they can't, given the sort of regulatory environment. That is a major problem, I think, for this space.
Awesome. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, Simone?
Just a quick one. Thank you so much, Jesse, for the talk. I think, as always, when you polarize things, you end up with interesting conversations. My question is more like a reflection. Don't you think that most of the innovation coming from Web3, it's rather on the completeness side than on the incomplete side?
Yeah, I do, and I also think that is disappointing. So I think, yes, I think it's true that so smart contract platforms like Ethereum and the like I think they are, this new canvas for developers to build automated systems that can execute in complete ways, right? That don't require ongoing human intervention because the blockchain just executes them as specified. And so again, that is one very exciting new thing. However, distributing ownership, like having smart contract enforced governance mechanism, that is also a new thing. And I think we haven't seen a lot of as much experimentation as I would have hoped we would see. Instead, what we've seen in the Web3 space is many systems sort of just many protocols just recreating shareholder voting, right, or share weighted voting or token weighted voting. There are a few projects innovating on the margins with new voting systems, quadratic voting, other mechanisms that are difficult to express in legal contracts, but easier to express in smart contracts that coordinate human behavior. But on the whole, I would say it's been there's not been as much innovation on that front as I thought we might have seen over the last, say, three to 5 years. But I do hope that we will see more. So again, like my view today is I want to see experiments on both ends of the extremes and ends of the spectrum, like things that are fully autonomous or at least strive to be, and then things that are really innovating on subjective human decision making using these new tools, because projects do need it where they are incomplete.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, just to clarify, I mean, the point that I was making is that now you have this innovation of complete contracts, but we still have to figure out what kind of institutions we can build on top,
Right.
and probably there is some space where we need this new type of institutions that are powered by these complete contracts. For example, when I think about token-based governance, it's kind of a new way of new type of governance that we can build thanks to these complete contracts. So when I said, don't you think that the innovation is coming from the complete side? I was making a point that now we have complete contracts and we didn't have them before.
Yeah, no, I think that is it's a good point. It breaks down the sort of barriers between the extremes I'm describing, because obviously that's just a high contrast way of framing it. But yeah, like to make maybe more concrete through example, Malak DAO, I gave the example earlier, has this rage quit mechanism, which is a way for a human or a bot to say, I don't agree with the decision that this group of owners made, and so I'm leaving with my stake in this thing. And you don't have that kind of immediately enforceable recourse in traditional corporate governance, because executing that logic through legal contracts is very complicated, but it's very simple in smart contracts. So you can have this completeness of the mechanism of rage quitting and leaving with your stuff, and that opens up new opportunities for designing systems that are kind of incomplete, that are responsive to human input. So there is a mix between these two that is interesting and underexplored in my view.
Totally. Thank you.
Okay. Any final question for the last minute before we wrap up? Okay.
Yeah, just want to say thank you
please.
for having me. This was this good to ask and like hear these questions asked and try to answer them, and like really interesting discussion. This has been a theme that I think is like run in the back of my head through every that I've used this. I use this framework for analyzing all kinds of projects in crypto, and so yeah, it's been good to pressure test some of the ideas with you all. Appreciate it.
No, thank you for coming on. This has been great. Thanks everyone, and see y'all tomorrow.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
We'll see y'all tomorrow with it's about 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Brian Johnson on the Blueprint protocol.